to be alone at the top. It is rather a networking model, wherein the goal is to connect with others, to be together at the center. Women are more likely to be concerned with such questions as, who is hurt and who is left out, than with such questions as, what are the rules? From Gilligan and others, we will learn more about men in leadership, men and women in leadership, as well as how men and women's approaches to spirituality will be different. But there is more to say on this topic. A friend of mine tells the story of the time at the conclusion of High Holy Day services during her first year as an ordained rabbi. Two congregants rushed up to talk to her. The first, a middle-aged woman, blurted out, "Rabbi, I can't tell you how different I feel about services because you are a woman. I found myself feeling that if you can be a woman, that if you can be a rabbi, then maybe I could be a rabbi too. For the first time in my life, I felt as though I could learn those prayers, I could study Torah, I could lead the service, I could do anything you could do. Also, the service made me think about God in a different way. I'm not sure why." The second congregant, a man in his late 20s, took her aside and said, "Rabbi, I realized that if you could be a rabbi, then certainly I could be a rabbi." Knowing that made the service somehow more accessible for me. I didn't need you to do it for me. I could do it, be involved with Jewish tradition, without depending on you. What are we to make of these two conversations? It seems that when women function as clergy, something happens. People experience her as less foreign, perhaps. The experience is more natural or accessible. In general, people don't attribute to women the power and prestige that they often attribute to men. Therefore, when women become rabbis or priests, there is often less social distance between the congregant and the clergy. The lessening of social distance and the reduction of the attribution of power and status can lead to the breakdown of hierarchy within a religious institution. If you can be a rabbi, then certainly I can be a rabbi. Clearly, some would argue that the breakdown of traditional religious hierarchy is bad. However, many of us would say that such a change could bring about a more profound and welcome situation. It could lead to synagogues that see their rabbi not as professional Jew or authoritarian leader, but as a teacher in the best sense of the Jewish tradition, and that see the congregations not as passive consumers of the rabbi's wisdom, but as active participants in their own Jewish lives. Furthermore, for as long as the rabbi has been a man, a Jew has often projected the image of the rabbi onto God. But when Jews encounter a rabbi who is a woman, it forces them to think about God as more than male, more than female. It provokes them to raise questions like, what or who is God? What do I believe about God? Perhaps these questions and more can lead us to consider a more authentic relationship to Jewish tradition and to God. In the second stage, we look carefully at liturgy, and specifically at the language of our prayers and the ways we talk to God. Since tomorrow's talk is devoted to this subject, I will only briefly mention it here. In this stage, we confront the dominance of masculine imagery in Jewish prayer, and we ask, is it enough to substitute pronouns, to say God, she, instead of God, he? What other images are available to us in our tradition? How can we express our kinship with God? But the issue of the maleness of God language does not end there. It moves us to question the nature of the God we pray to. How do we think about God? Where do we find God in our experience? Is God up there, transcendent, above it all? Is God near us, within us, close by, within each person and thing and tree we see? What images will most powerfully evoke and express the reality of God in our lives? In this stage, we will also question the very notion of the canon of the prayer book. For we will ask, how have women prayed in the past? Are there women's prayers that we too can use and incorporate into the prayer book? And we will ask, are there not prayers and blessings that we can write that speak of God and that speak of our own experiences and our own quest for the divine? What does it mean to make changes in the liturgy? What are the risks? Where will we find communities to say them in? In the second stage, women have had an intense interest in ritual. We have asked, what is ritual, and from whence comes its power? For as women, many of us are moved by ritual and by its power to transform. We recognize that ritual, by the very nature of its repetitiveness and predictability, triggers deep and cognitive responses within us associated with spirituality. We recognize that, among other things, ritual makes profound statements about our values and our place in the social and religious order. In this stage, we have looked for, rediscovered, recovered, reinterpreted, or invented rituals that speak to and reflect our experience. Sometimes we have taken traditional forms, like the celebration of Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, seen by our tradition as a women's holiday, but long forgotten in practice. Because of its connection to the moon and monthly cycles of fertility, we are experimenting all over the country in small Rosh Chodesh groups with a mix of old and new symbols and prayers. We have, for example, reclaimed the mikvah, the ancient ritual bath for spiritual immersion, and we use it now for feminine rituals of rebirth. We have brought a new focus to Passover with the feminist Seder, where we seek to tell the story, Haggadah, by building on the theme of liberation, to make women's experience and struggle an issue for all to discuss. In this stage, we ask not only whether women can participate in traditional celebration of rituals, but do these express women's deepest spiritual feelings? What must we do to become shapers of the holy? As a friend of mine asked upon the death of her mother, how have Jewish women traditionally mourned their mothers? Are there customs or obligations which women, exempt from saying Kaddish, have developed to observe and to go through mourning? If there are not, can we shape new responses? So at times, if we cannot recover or rediscover, we do invent, so that the tradition expands to speak to the moments of life that are especially part of a woman's experience. Giving birth, weaning, rearing children, having an abortion, experiencing a miscarriage or menopause. We remember and we invent because ritual helps us come close to God's healing powers and presence. In this stage, we ask, how can ritual help deepen the spiritual lives of men and women together as they experience together infertility, sexuality, adoption, parenting, and empty nest? And here we begin to sense where feminist religious thought can take us. For feminists, Judaism will mean not only the restoration of women, but the recovery of the feminine element in other spheres as well, such as the ways we relate to the environment, the earth, and our place on it. Arthur Waskow puts it this way: we need to hear the true Torah, which teaches the necessity of rhythm, of making Shabbos, of pausing to take a breath, to rest, to meditate, to contemplate. Especially the need to pause from incessant exploitive economic development. Not to end development, but to pause long enough to sense again its limitations, its purpose, and its owner. In the last decade or so, we have come to see that 300 years of life without a Shabbat has brought us near the edge of killing the human race and poisoning the biosphere. The world is teaching us that if we will not stop ourselves in accord with Torah by making Shabbat, by allowing things to lie fallow and renew, we will stop ourselves by catastrophic force. The sense of biological and social rhythm, the week, the month, the sabbatical year, the jubilee year, may very well have come into our tradition out of some matriarch's closely sensing of her body and of Mother Earth. We need to hear that teaching. In the second stage, we ask, not can women read Torah in public, but what about the essence of Torah itself? In light of our concerns, we struggle with what Torah means and with what it is. And some would say the task is impossible, that the central text of the Jewish spiritual tradition is neither a tree of life nor a wellspring of redemptive waters, that it is contaminated beyond repair, that the Hebrew Bible itself seems to supply the very models for women's oppression that makes it urgent to assign it to the annals of our distant archaeological past and get on with the issues of contemporary change. For many, though, this is not possible. It is not possible with most things, including our own lives, to create a present in dramatic discontinuity with the past, much less with a religious tradition, much less with a tradition as text-centered as ours. And so, like feminist historians with secular history, we too go searching for women's voices and experiences, for our mothers and sisters and heroes like Vashti, for the element of the feminine in Torah. We go exploring with new eyes, noticing images or stories or details we've never noticed before, reading between the lines to find our history. For we realize that history, including religious history, has been written by the male elite, and that the voices and traditions of women and men not in the elite was suppressed by those with power and authority. We go God wrestling, as one writer put it, bringing to Torah the questions that reflect our own unique concerns, struggling to discover new layers of meaning. But this, after all, is an old Jewish tradition, is it not? By the process of reinterpretation and allegorical interpretation and symbolic understanding, Jews have always brought their ideas to the sacred text. Like the rabbis of old, we assume the infinite meaningfulness of biblical text. We take passages that are troubling or sketchy and we write them forward. We recognize, as they did no doubt, that writing and interpreting is a way to shape the world. And so we create midrash. Together and individually, orally and in writing, we tell new stories, and we retell old stories that connect our ancient history with our lives in the present. We tell, for example, the story of the binding of Isaac, but this time from Sarah's perspective. Because otherwise we have in the Bible only half the story. Perhaps Abraham does believe that God wants him to sacrifice Isaac. But Sarah, in a new midrash, believes that their God is a God of love, not cruelty, and would never have placed such a demand upon them. And perhaps those who hear such commands should question whether they have heard God correctly. Or we tell the story like the one that you now have, Applesauce, the story of Adam and Eve and the other woman, Lilith, in the Garden of Eden, exploring particularly the relationships between the women in the garden. We will hear the story of Hagar in a new way, and in doing so, tell the story of all bag ladies and surrogate mothers everywhere. We retell the story of Miriam, who with her well nurtured and gave leadership to the generation of the desert. We reread the Exodus story and discover that it is women who nurture the revolution, that it is the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who are the first conscientious objectors, standing up for the preservation of human life. Feminist biblical scholar Phyllis Tribble writes, "A patriarchal religion which creates and preserves feminist traditions like these contain resources for overcoming patriarchy. And it is new interpretive work like hers that continues to help us reread Scripture, to find ourselves and our own experiences in the texts, to uncover the essence and richness of biblical faith without sexism." But here too we will ask fundamentals of our faith. For what is Torah? Is it the 5 books alone? What of our own newly created midrash? Will we consider that Torah as well? Was Revelation a one-time event only at Sinai? Or are there many Sinais? Many events of revelation that occur even in our lifetime? Once again, authority is questioned. The absoluteness, the fixed nature of Torah is questioned. The very authority that suppressed women's voices, the authority that created the traditions that we want to be part of, is the very authority that we question and challenge. In certain ways, these questions are not new and not intrinsic to women's experience. The rabbis themselves, by putting forward the notion of 2 Torahs given at Mount Sinai, seem to be saying that the written Torah by its very nature was incomplete, needing completion by the teachings of the oral tradition. Revelation, they seem to be saying, was an ongoing process. In modern times, too, liberal Jews have questioned the canon of Torah and choose to see revelation as an ongoing experience, and the canon of Torah as wider, much wider than the 5 books. As one Israeli educator said, "What is Torah? Anything that helps young people to live purposefully. That is Torah." Some would say that the feminist challenge is not necessarily different than others we have faced throughout Jewish history. That Jewish thought has often succeeded in integrating and responding to other systems of thought, whether it has been Aristotelian philosophy or Gnosticism or pantheism. They would say that one of the things that characterizes Judaism has been its tremendous flexibility and openness to a wide range of theological speculation. Others would say, we are at the edge of something more radical, a new paradigm, like at the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. One that leads us to question and rethink all the fundamentals of Jewish faith. They would say, like Judith Plaskow, that women cannot be fully part of Judaism without a complete transformation of Jewish life. For many, if not for most, what I have been describing here particularly the issues of the second stage, may sound foreign. It may feel like it goes too far from that which we expect and look for in our religious life, namely the connectedness and rootedness to the past, the authenticity that comes from being a part of a long chain of tradition with all its time-honored rituals and symbols. As one student responded when I described to her some of the new prayers feminists have written, which we'll look at tomorrow, "Wow, I didn't know you could do that." And then in the very next breath, she said, "But it would be weird to say those words because they wouldn't be traditional." New approaches to ritual and liturgy and text will raise questions about tradition, questions about unity, questions about authenticity, all of which reminds us of the problems and possibilities before us. To my students and to myself, I ask, what kind of function will religion play in our lives? Will it serve a conservative function to preserve and to anchor? Or will it play a creative role, not only being shaped by, but actively shaping the tradition we call ours? The movement of renewal speaks to all, to men and to women, all who seek the dimension of the spiritual. Judith Plaskow writes it this way: "The most profound, intriguing, and inviting of all Jewish theologies, the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, teaches us that exile is the fundamental reality of present-day existence. It teaches that one of the causes of exile is the alienation of the masculine from the feminine in God, the alienation of God and the Shekhinah. But it also teaches, especially in its later phases, that each of us can participate in healing the world by dedicating all of our efforts to the reunification of God and the Shekhinah. Now that the masculine and feminine have been torn asunder, such work of healing is a mitzvah, a religious command. When the masculine and the feminine aspects of God have been reunited, and the female half of humanity has been returned from exile, we will begin to have our healing. The world will then be repaired."
See, at this time we'd like to entertain questions from the floor, and maybe it'd be better if the two of you came up here and bring your chairs with you so you can feel comfortable. Okay, I guess we should moderate. Yes?
I had a question to the rabbi. Women's prayers. This is a trick question. My grandmother used to have a women's prayer book. I had no idea what was in it, but I figured it was from women's viewpoint.
Yes, and those prayers, often in Yiddish, I suspect those prayers were in Yiddish. Often the women's prayers that we are uncovering now were written in Yiddish. Women were often not educated they didn't learn Hebrew, but they knew Yiddish. And so they wrote the prayers that were their own examples of spirituality, their own prayers in the language that they knew, in Yiddish. We have Sena Urena, we have different anthologies of those prayers, and now we are learning more about them and asking, wouldn't we want to include those as well in the prayer book? In other words, how did the prayers that we have in the prayer book get there? And since the prayer book itself developed over several thousand years, maybe we want to consider now including some of those prayers, just like in the 16th century we included the prayers of the mystics, and it's an anthology, and so those prayers in Yiddish we're now considering, them as part of the canon of the Jewish prayer book.
Okay, yes, Ed?
Well, back to Gemara. Though Yiddish is relatively recent, were there any older evidence of similar kinds of writings?
We can uncover Hannah's prayer examples from the Bible itself, focusing in on someone like Hannah and her prayer and beseeching of God for a child. That's there. The Talmud elaborates on that even further. We just haven't focused on those things. If we were to read the text with new eyes, the feeling is that we would find, even within the tradition written by men for men, more examples. At least we could have something to begin with. The Lilith, I mentioned Lilith. There is a tradition. How many have heard about Lilith? Okay, so many of you know Lilith. That's part of Jewish folklore. And the example that I gave you is written by Judith Plaskow. That's kind of a contemporary story about Lilith. In other words, the traditional Lilith is, that story is written to kind of put Lilith down because she was such an assertive woman and did want equality with Adam in the garden. And so the folklore is that not only did she fly away and leave the garden, but she then went on to become a demoness and to kill Jewish babies, hundreds and thousands. And that's why in medieval times, as part of the folk culture, people would put amulets on cribs because of this notion of the Lilith, the feminine demoness that would come to destroy the babies. So it was a negative. Lilith was turned into a negative. Judith Plaskow recaptures the tradition of Lilith, but recasts it in a more positive vein.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, Ed, sure.
I'm sorry, we're nominated here, but I'm wondering, when was the first ordination in your church?
In the Anglican Church worldwide, a woman priest was ordained in China, on the island of, actually in China for the island of Macau in 1943. And the church was so horrified by this that she agreed to withdraw from functioning as a priest after the war, and she has since been rediscovered and celebrated. She's now, that was more than 40 years ago. Her name is Florence Lee Tim Moy. In the United States, then of course the second wave of women were again ordained in Hong Kong this time in 1971. And we're very, we have a great debt to our sisters in China. Yes.
Who did the ordaining?
Why is this all happening in the areas?
I think I can't give you I can just give you my ideas on that. I think maybe the people there were practical and realized that these women were needed. Florence Lee Tim Moy was she was a deacon then, was the only ordained person who could get in and out. The men were not able to pass through Japanese enemy lines. And she had a very thriving ministry there, and the people desperately needed her priestly ministry. And so she went on a very long and arduous and dangerous trip through enemy lines over the mountains to meet in a prearranged meeting with Bishop Hall of China, or Hong Kong. And he examined her, and they had a retreat, and then he ordained her. So it was done at great personal risk, and obviously it was a godly act. Yes.
Yeah, just a commentary on that. After having lived in the third world, I think you'll find third world peoples are much more open to women in religion, in professional religion, leadership positions in religion. than in the first world. And it may be because in some of those societies, they're matriarchal societies, although they claim to be macho cultures, but the backbone of those cultures are the women. It's true. I have a question for you. I recently attended a workshop in Des Moines, and there was a feminist from Chicago, and it was brought up, how are women to get involved in the hierarchy in the Roman Catholic Church? And she said, oh, we're not interested in that, because that is filled with power and is filled with prestige, and we're going to leave that to the men. If they want it, they can have it. And we will pursue another way, a way where authority is self-evident. And one comes to mind, two people, Dorothy Day, who served the poor in New York, and Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who serves the poor in India. Two women who could walk into the office of any president in the world or address any assembly on the basis of what they gave of their heart. And it's been talked about that this should be then the way for women to establish their credentials today. And that's fine for extraordinary women, but what about ordinary women? Do you want to address that?
Well, this is the complicated issue that I alluded to earlier, and I got that from my contact with leading Roman Catholic women, especially in the 70s, who felt that they did not want to fall into the traps of the power things. And I see this especially happening in the Anglican Church. The Episcopal Church now today is getting far more centralized, and higher titles, more precise titles, and tightness is really happening. And I think this is a dangerous thing. I think it's also happening in our secular society. I think the fact that you can't have a bank account without a social security number is something that's very dangerous in our culture. And I think that's related to this negation of the hierarchy by women who have their eyes open pretty wide. I don't know how I personally feel about that, because I feel that a little bit like Bishop Corrigan saying to us, I think if we have the opportunity to get within some of these structures and try to help, that's a little arrogant to say, to help clean them up, that's better. But I also think, and I was searching while you were talking about Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa, there certainly must be men who have done similar things without titles on the door and bigelows on the floor, who can walk into presidential offices. And it's back to what Christian's boss told us to do, which is to serve. I mean, you know how boring it is to sit around with our bigelows on the floor and have everybody else doing all the fun things. I mean, I really don't think that's as much fun as getting out there and getting your hands dirty and being with people. And that's on a spiritual plane and on a serving plane and on just being part of this planet and this human race. That's where it's at. So sure, we can be bishops, or we can be priests, or we can be garbage collectors. We're all working together for this wonderful earth that God has given all of us authority over.
Katrina?
Yes.
We do have women in powerful places, like Golda
Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir, certainly.
So there must be some roots for other women.
I think women and men are all human, And the main thing is we have a variety of vision, of function, of spirituality, and some of that variety is really very, very good. But some of it we have to be very careful of and transform. That's the arrogant word I was looking for. I don't know whether that's the answer you wanted.
Yes.
A couple of things that came out here that are interesting contrasts between Judaism and Christianity, and different roles and opportunities for women. One is that there's no equivalent in Judaism to the orders in Christianity that we refer to. The other is that the Jewish religion lacks a hierarchical structure, and so that the way that the opportunities and the challenges seem quite different in some respects. Maybe there are things to be learned either way.
You want to take that one?
Well, right, you take it now. Yeah, one thing I haven't mentioned in my talk is the whole system of Jewish law. And were there some Orthodox Jews here to really, represent that position, it would be even more controversial, I think, what I had to say, because, really, that whole system, it's not it is a hierarchy in a sense. I haven't talked much about it, but in a sense it is a hierarchy in the sense that there is a legal system, and it's run by, and represented by men. And for women that want to be part of that system, traditional Jews, it becomes much more of a problem, to want to be part of that system and to want to be a feminist or hold on to some of those values, because the Jewish legal system in and of itself is done by, is interpreted by, is promulgated by men. Women cannot serve as witnesses. Women cannot be judges. Women are not, at least at this point, the decisors. They do not decide Jewish law. That's all done by men. So for people who are part of that system, that's an even more difficult thing to get into. And I didn't really represent that very much. But so it may not be a hierarchy. To be a decisor, to be a posek, one needs merely to be very knowledgeable in Jewish law. It's not an inherited kind of a position. So I would just kind of throw that out to make it a little more, difficult, and so that it doesn't seem so easy.
What you're saying to me gave me a response to what your question is: why would women want to be in hierarchy or authority rather than just be Dorothy Day, not just be, but aspire to be a Dorothy Day, the other direction. And I think that's the answer, would be that it is the people in a hierarchy who are going to
Make the
interpret,
decisions, yeah.
do what you had mentioned, give another viewpoint, bring this whole thing out, together. Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa can not do that. I think.
So we need one another, right? We complement one another. Okay. Yes, final question.
I had a question for Rabbi Jacobs, and I wondered if you could expound a little bit on, and I forget the exact word that you used, but it was recapture, regain, the mikvah, the ritual bath, which I was aware was apparently, quote, coming back in Reform Judaism. I would just be interested in your perspective on that, particularly vis-a-vis Reform Judaism.
Well, I hate to put things in categories, and the movement for Jewish renewal does too, because somehow those categories have limited us in terms of our possibilities, you see, because sometimes when you say you're reform, it conjures up in people's minds things that you don't do. And the movement for renewal is much more interested in what are all those possibilities out there, especially the ones that we've thrown out, that maybe we can reclaim or reconsider. Okay, so I have a problem personally in speaking in category, in terms of the labels. With the mikvah, it's being used now by women as part of women's rituals to mark points of renewal in their lives. For example, I don't do this, but a friend of mine in St. Louis, who is in a congregation, does this. She has been approached by women who have gone through certain experiences in their lives, generally very painful experiences. And sometimes it's a matter of age. They're at a point where they kind of see themselves as they're at a different stage of their lives. And they wish to mark those points by a ritual. And that it seems appropriate for them to do, one element of the ritual, to immerse in the ritual bath, as a way of kind of saying, the old is in the past, and I am on to a new stage. I am kind of renewing myself, whether I'm, age 60 and I'm at a new stage of growth and development, whether it's because, I have suffered certain things in my life, and I want to experience the healing powers of the water of the mikvah, and that those are leading me to rebirth. It's really the same thing we go through every year with Yom Kippur. Okay, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is really, it really represents a day of death and rebirth. I mean, that is why traditionally we wear a kittel, the death shrouds. Okay, now I know that sounds weird, but I'm just kind of explaining that that's what conceptually the Day of Atonement is. We ask forgiveness for our sins. We dress in white. It is as if we are going through a death and emerging at the end of a very long day of fasting and prayer and emerging anew. It's rebirth. Okay, so that's the same concept that we're doing with these rituals. It's a way of kind of going through the old, or saying the old is part of us, but we're kind of moving on, and we want to experience the rebirth that a ritual can help us experience. So I appreciate your question about reform, but I purposely stay away from it because, see, the idea is that in Reform Judaism you don't use the mikvah. Okay, like when I take a convert through conversion and we go to the mikvah, people say, but you're Reform. Why do you use the mikvah? Okay, and my feeling is these are all rituals that are there that can be very powerful and which sometimes can give meaning to our lives. Sometimes they can't, and so we exclude them, but very often they can. And in particular, Reform Judaism has, in its early classical stages, made a very conscious decision to dispense with many rituals, in order to stay in the more rational sphere of religiosity. I think there's a new thinking within Reform that's going on now, and many people are wanting to kind of reclaim some of those symbols and traditions that were cast off.
By definition in society and most of history, if something becomes feminized, it therefore becomes inferior. For example, secretaries when they were men were cowards, secretaries when they're women are not going to advance.
Maybe that's why I'm reluctant to flop it over. I really think that the hope is for all of us working together and not to compartmentalize. And one of the things that I feel really strongly about is when we talk about imaging God, which we really haven't talked about very much tonight. I hope that as we try to get closer to God, we can take God out of the boxes of images, because I think images tend to narrow down the scope of a God that's infinite, that should not be narrowed down. And so to go along with the giving God a lot of space so that I think we can really, in the long run, get closer to God if we don't narrow those images down. Unfortunately, I think images were maybe brought into being to help us get closer to God. And therefore, I think if we try not to feminize anything or masculinize everything, but just say, and interesting, I used the word everything and anything accidentally just then, so that, even those of us who are working in the field, quote unquote, we slip into those old ways. But I think if we can humanize ourselves and realize that men have lots of variety, I keep trying to tell people, women are just like men, we're different from each other, we're not all going to be alike. And so if we can focus on being together, working together, and as Damhildur Kamara of Brazil said, cut down the divisions. So nobody has to be first and second class citizens, so we can all work together as God's friends. That's where I think it's at. By the way, I forgot to put in a plug. I've got some books for sale back there for $15. Don't feel you have to buy them, but if anybody is interested, there's a can back there, just put the money in it. It's a book that George and I republished about the ordination of women. It was written by a man in the 20s about ordination of women in England. They still don't have women priests there. And George has written a foreword and a catch-up thing at the end telling a little bit of the history.